Hello and welcome to the Full Scottish here on Broadcasting Scotland. My name's Kenny McBride and I'm joined today by two wonderful guests. Firstly, by the former co-convener of the Scottish Green Party and currently convener of the Scottish Independence Convention, Maggie Chapman. Maggie, how are you this morning?
Hi, good morning or good afternoon, Kenny. I'm doing very well, thank you. Lovely to be with you again, even if remotely.
Excellent. And on the other side of me, we have Dr. Alan Flowers, who we had on just the other day talking about Russia and Belarus and whatnot. He's an academic based in London, but Scottish through and through, and a long-term advocate for the people of Belarus. Alan, how are you doing today?
Yes, greetings from London, and I'm from Kingston University, a lovely sunny London. Looking forward to the discussion.
Excellent. Well, we do start with Belarus. The election, of course, was held last week, and the opposition leader Svetlana Tikhanovskaya appeared to have done very well, but the results in the end showed that Lukashenko had won some 80% of the vote. Very few people believe that, and there is now an ongoing movement to try and get that result reversed. Alan, tell us a wee bit about how you've been responding to this, because I know you've been protesting with some Belarusians down in London.
The very first and important matter is what it is actually we're responding to. You're using the phrase results. I'd like to help our viewers to understand what really means results in this context. Yeah. It is a number that is announced by the chair of the Electoral Commission. It is a number that cannot verifiably be backed up by any totaling of visible voting records because it's not permitted to get access to any of the counting process. So the opposition there had a much more visible and verifiable way of generating a result, and that was not only through exit polls, but people wearing around their wrists little white bands and ribbons, so people could actually be visibly counted as they came out the polling stations. So the fact is, we're really dealing with two results to react to. There is a result that is a statement that has come out of the dictatorship as a number, which has given Lukashenko around 80%. And there is a very visible number that any of the records online, through exit polls, and through the visible actions of the people, has come out a lot nearer somewhere, maybe around about 70, in some polling stations 80%, others about 65% for Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. And so therefore, for that reason, I, with a wonderful team here in London, young professionals who've come over from Belarus. They're working within the British community. Many of them have been active in the National Health Service in the last months. They got together, self-organized. One thing we find about Belarusians, they're wonderful self-organizers. And I've been using the analogy partisans. So what we've got popping up in London, around Britain, and in fact right across the world, this is now an international movement for Belarus, and particularly within Belarus, every city, every small town, these partisan type people are just self-organizing and coming out of the woodwork. This is possibly one of the strongest popularist movements we've ever seen across, certainly in Europe, in recent years. It is quite remarkable, and I've been very happy to help out and facilitate. And we were outside the Foreign Office, around 300 Belarusians at the time we were there, and a total of about 500 came and were in Whitehall, and I was very pleased to be facilitating that yesterday. We got another event tomorrow, 1,600. So down in London, we're really trying to waken up the Foreign Office to this issue. And I know in Scotland there's a marvellous event today. Maybe during the programme we'll check out exactly where it is and be able to give an announcement.
Yeah. What has the response been then from the Foreign Office and other kind of international bodies so far? Has there been any real reaction yet?
Oh yes, well, I mean, we did get a reaction, a calling for the cessation of violence, because in Belarus on the Sunday, Monday, Tuesday there was really quite unacceptable levels of violence, the beating of peaceful people, the grabbing of people off the street almost randomly, uh, arrivals in the night at homes, people being taken out of their accommodation in the night. Something like nearly 7,000 people are arrested in the early part of this week, and including, sadly, two deaths as well. So the British Foreign Office has reacted to that. They've made calls, they've made condemnations of what is happening, but the issue is, unlike the European Union that came out with some very clear statements about targeted sanctions, very important to use this word targeted, sanctions on the people who are exercising the torture and the violence. The torture issue is one we'll maybe come to later. What is happening in the prisons of Belarus in 21st century Europe by any international standard of human rights is totally unacceptable. Now, we cannot criticize the British government for taking a moral stand and for voicing this position. Where the concern is we haven't yet heard how they will back this up by any action that would have an impact. Maybe later I can explain the complex situation that the British Foreign Office has got itself into over being in a Brexit transition and its relation to the decisions in the EU. So to some extent we can understand some difficulties. But I think we could have heard more, and we certainly should have heard more on Friday evening after the EU made very concrete decisions about imposing targeted sanctions. The EU has decided on this, and also there are strong offers for mediation. And some EU countries have actually clearly stated that Mr. Lukashenko, they're describing him as the former president of Belarus.
So how effective do you think all this is going to be? I mean, it's you don't hold on to power for 26 years without having some tricks up your sleeve. Do you think Lukashenko can and will be removed now?
Well, the tricks were he always managed to keep enough people believing they were happy not to turn out in the numbers we have seen in the last days. And not only the last days, but before the election, you could see the way the wind was blowing. There was the largest ever political rally in Minsk just before the election in the first week of August this year that had been seen since 91, the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Over 60,000 people appearing at a political rally in Minsk was unheard of. So there clearly was a wind blowing, a wind of demands for freedom and for a demand for change. Here we go, it's the old 60s winds of change appearing, but it's for Belarus finally. And this is very much a populist movement, and has even reached factories. The major factories are now on strike and came out on strike over the weekend. So how is he going to deal with it? He really is in a very difficult position. He can turn to Putin, but the price that Putin will exact will be enormous. He may well be reduced to essentially being a leader of a Russian republic. The independence of Belarus would be at stake in any negotiations, and that's actually what Vladimir Putin would very much potentially seek. On the other side, his best option really would be to start getting round the negotiating table and come to some compromise that would at least keep and enable more easily the existing government, many members of the existing government, to transition, as has been the history in many of the former communist states. Plenty of track record here, plenty of precedent to look to what happened in '89, how you could have peaceful transfer of power. So he's got President Lukashenko, former President Lukashenko, as I will call him, former President Lukashenko has very few options now. He's sitting in the building with a security service around him, and basically the levers of government are melting away in all kinds of directions.
Mm. Now, Maggie, just to turn to you, I don't know if your expertise on Belarus is anywhere near Alan's, but what's been your response seeing what's been happening in Belarus over the last 7 days?
Thanks, Kenny. You're right. I have no expertise on Belarus, but I think just looking at it, two things strike me. Firstly, the absolute imperative that we use the political institutions we have at our disposal, but also a sense of social solidarity, because as Alan says, it's a populist movement. It's a social movement that is driving the change, and potentially driving a very, very clear political change in Belarus, and that's something I think we can hold on to. It's something that gives me hope if it's coming from the people, and if the people have the capacity to not let themselves or not be silenced. And I hear what Alan says about the brutality and the force that is being used against them. But I think that's something that we need to take note of. And the other thing I think, which maybe goes back in time and goes to the history of the Soviet Union and its demise, and the role that the British state and other Western states had in that, and how it was a very, very clear asset stripping. There was a targeted desire to disaster capitalist asset strip those countries, to put the economic resources in the hands of a very, very few, very powerful oligarchs. And we are seeing the consequences of that play out in Belarus now. And I think that there's not only a moral responsibility that Alan, but there's a very, very clear political responsibility that we need to understand, and we need to take in helping to sort this message out, whether it is by targeted economic means, or other ways. I think the other thing we need to be very, very clear about is providing aid and support and refuge to people who might need it in the coming weeks and months, if things get very, very much more violent and very much worse for people there.
Mm. And Alan, just turn back to you. Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, the woman who was running against Lukashenko in the election, she is now in exile in Lithuania. What's her situation now from what you've been able to understand?
Yes, I think we should qualify this with an adjective. This is in no way a voluntary exile, and it's not something that in any normal circumstances she would have wished for. But she is a mother. She has children. I'm pleased to say that they are safe in Lithuania and have been throughout the process. And therefore she has been put under extreme pressure in respect. And she also has a husband who is in prison. One of these prisons where torture is taking place daily on most of the inmates. So you can imagine the horrendous position she's in. But fortunately, she is hosted by the government of Lithuania. They are very much respecting her position as the rightful representative, at the very least as the rightful representative of the Belarusian people, certainly as the absolutely clear representative of the many tens, hundreds of thousands that are coming out on the streets. So I'm very pleased to see Lithuania has taken a very major role in this, and she is seeking to create a national council. This is something a little bit like Poland had in '89. The round table discussions that took place. She is calling for a peaceful transition and very much calling out for non-violence. And we have seen the people that have supported her have come to the street with flowers and balloons, and the Belarusian people absolutely do not seek violence. However, visibly observed Serbian riot troops, people being imported into the country to clear the streets and grab people to be thrown into these what are the torture cells of Belarus. We're not seeing quite the same peaceful approach from the regime. It has quietened down, by the way, since the strong calls from the EU and international countries since Thursday evening through Friday. And I hope we're going to see today a very large demonstration of support for Svetlana Tikhanovskaya that's peaceful and the real hope of everybody. And I think the best option for Alexander Lukashenko would be to get to that negotiating table as quickly as possible and deal with the transition. There really is now no way out. He is either going to be a very weak puppet of Russia, or and might well even end up in prison, because that pathway would potentially lead to a huge violence, even maybe a civil war. The Belarus people do not wish to be a republic of Vladimir Putin. That is absolutely quite clear. I've got a flag behind me that is an independence flag that will be. The red is very symbolic of the blood that has been spilled for the Belarus lands.
Yeah. Well, we do wish everyone in Belarus the best, obviously, and we will keep watching that story to see how it develops. But also this week, that marks Earth Overshoot Day. This is the day when the resources expended by the people of Earth exceeds what the Earth can afford to use in a year. So Maggie, obviously in your political career, this has been something that's driven you for decades. Is it something now that you think the rest of us are finally starting to get a grip on?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting question, Kenny. I think we've seen in the last, couple of years with the work being done by young people, by people like Greta Thunberg and other climate activists in Scotland and around the world, people starting to recognise what's actually happening. And, with the Scottish Government declaring a climate emergency, that was, I think, quite a significant step. But we desperately need to see clear strategic action following that. And I think it's important to recognize that these kinds of parameters give us important stories to tell, and the I think that the very powerful stories that the young climate activists are talking about, it's about reclaiming their future. It's not about changing or completely overturning any of the progress as society that we've made in the last few decades. It's about understanding that in many ways they feel that their future has been stolen, and we need to desperately do something about that. So we need to recognize the urgent need for what we in the Greens and across the movement have called the Green and New Deal, which is the decoupling of living standards from carbon emissions. We know that our economy based on carbon is a dead end. It is going to destroy not only our life support systems, our planet, but it will ultimately end up destroying us. And we know that it actually doesn't deliver the kind of equality and the kind of wealth for all that we've been told for the last 40 years it will. We know that's a lie, and we know that's a lie very, very clearly. We don't need to look very far in any community in Scotland to see that. So we have the opportunity to really transform our economy, away from one that is debilitating, that is restricting, to one that opens up the opportunities for so many different people in different ways, and gives our children and our children's children back their future. We need to see a rapid decarbonisation of our energy system. We need to see a dramatic transformation from the carbon economy into a green economy that supports integrated sustainable transport, that supports an agriculture system that is about the production of food for people, not the production of profit for a few landowners. And in doing so, we not only create of jobs that we want to see, well-paid, long-term, secure jobs for the future, but we also know that that will bring with it an increase in well-being and equality. I think if we look at the work that the We All Alliance is doing, the work that Catherine Trebek and others are doing on this, there's something really, really important. And we have, I think, a real opportunity. We've seen over the last 6 months society be transformed almost completely. The COVID pandemic, the public health crisis that we faced, has meant a huge change in how we function on a day-to-day level. It's seen significant investment in areas that were considered unimportant before, and it's shone a light on the kinds of things we really, really value. Security of food supply, security of access to that food, security to be able to get the health provisions that we need, not the things that our economy has valued over the last 20, 30, 40 years, which is how big people's bank accounts in the Cayman Islands are. And I think that we can learn from what's happened over the last 6 months and use some of that creative and transformative potential to say, actually, we can, and not only can we do something better, but we absolutely have to create a very, very different kind of world. So one of the sort of slogans is maybe the wrong word, but one of the phrases going around throughout the COVID crisis is how we can build back better. And I think there's quite a lot in that message. Let's not go back to normal. Let's create a very different kind of society, a society where our teachers and healthcare professionals and other public services are really, really valued, where we understand the importance of food supply chains and ensuring that we have security in those chains, and we actually make them much more resilient and much more able to deal with crises in the future. Because what we know with climate change is that over the coming years, we are going to see an increase of dramatic and disastrous weather events. We don't need to go into it too much, but we've seen some of the consequences of that in Scotland just this last week. And we need to be in a position where we know our systems, all of our systems, have the resilience to deal with that. And at the moment, we don't. And so I think there's some very, very important learning for us to do. There are lots of specific policies and processes that we can look at, like using Scottish National Investment Bank to finance the energy transition, using those similar finance mechanisms to really invest in food security. And I think we need to see those kinds of radical changes coming from the Scottish government, but coming and being developed in communities as well, because there is huge creative potential in our communities, and we just need to be able to harness that in a way that is not exploitative, that is inclusive, and that gives people power over their everyday lives.
And Alan, just to come to you quickly on this one as well. I mean, I assume you don't have the kind of in-depth knowledge that Maggie has on this subject either, but how much do you think this is getting into people's heads, that we are really going to have to start doing some things very, very differently if we are going to survive?
Yes, this is where I have to pull the rabbit out of the hat. 35 years ago, I was lecturing on resources science at Kingston, what was then Kingston Polytechnic, and have for most of my life been engaged in academic aspects of resources and environmental science. So I've been following with huge interest what has just been said, and agree not 200% with all the points we just heard. And in particular, though, I do think we should be proud of the Scottish position on the baseload, the mainstream energy supply, particularly the way the electricity supply industries have responded. because we've supported all this massive offshore wind power. This is now, wind power is making a major contribution. I do agree on the fact we've still got a long way to go, of course, with this carbon economy. And accelerating the trend towards electrification is clearly one way, and clearly not enough is being done in that area. There's also, I fully agree about this change and transition post-COVID. My goodness, haven't we learned how many can work at home? A completely different change in the workplace environment. Isn't it so crazy that we jump in these petrol-driven cars, so many of us, to drive considerable distances, to sit in an office behind a computer? And I have to say, I remember some days I would go to my desk at the university and realize all I had done is just sat there in front of my communication systems with a telephone beside me, and the people interaction on some days could be limited. And of course, we've found how we can communicate better. Do we need to physically gather in places in order to have very useful, large-scale meetings and discussions? We're talking to a rector of Dundee University who's very aware of how well many colleagues in our university have adapted to communications with their students online. So we're clearly seeing all sorts of ways in which we can reduce our dependence on carbons. That's referring to the whole transport access, our use of hydrocarbons, the gradual diminution of plastics. So yes, I mean, the big disappointment in my life of over 35 years of lecturing environmental sciences that we were calling about global warming. I remember a model 20 years ago. I used to teach students about how you could model different scenarios, and there was going to be these temperature increases, and calling for action. Sadly, economic interests, this whole coupling with lifestyle we've just been hearing about, it's been a big ball and chain around the process of transition, and it's very sad that the human race has to really feel the heat, literally feel the heat, before we get a turnaround. So, as a lifelong advocate of a balanced energy economy, by the way, my expertise is nuclear physics, but I can assure the people of Scotland that we're very fortunate. I would argue that we've got two of the best managed nuclear power stations in the world, just near Edinburgh and near Glasgow, Torness and Hunterston, providing a secure baseload for Scotland and exporting electricity from Scotland. But also we balanced that with a magnificent programme of renewable energies, particularly through wind. And after all, let's not forget, Scotland was out there with its hydro programme post-war, a magnificent Scottish hydro programme and lessons about pump storage and all that. Scotland, I think, has got a lot to teach the world on this, but we've also, and I absolutely agree, got a long way to go to adjust and really play a part in decarbonisation.
Absolutely. Well, we move on now to quarantine, and this week we saw quarantine reintroduced for France, amongst other countries, which led to a rush back from France for a number of tourists. A number of people, obviously, had gone to spend some time in France and had then realised they were going to have to get back very quickly if they wanted to avoid a 14-day quarantine when they got home. Maggie, coming to you first on this. Is it useful, do you think, that we're having these quarantines lifted and then reimposed on countries at very short notice?
I mean, I think there's so much that we can say about how different governments have dealt with this, but I think that the quarantine issue particularly is actually a really good example of the breakdown of international cooperation. We've seen very clearly, the British government and other governments that are maybe doing less well in their responses to the crisis. They are, I think it would be fair to call them chauvinist regimes. And it's all about exclusive deals. It's all about exclusive relationships rather than cooperation and collective approaches across international boundaries. And I think, the quarantine is just a small part of that. I think there's also a lot of deliberate misleading and misunderstanding about the value and importance of expertise, and the value and importance of scientific knowledge and the ability to understand and interpret that scientific knowledge effectively. And I think, the whole question about the lockdown in the UK didn't come soon enough, and therefore it was never going to work. We know that yes, it didn't come soon enough, but a very strict lockdown would have worked whenever it was imposed. And we can see the examples that countries like New Zealand have achieved, very, very low transmission rates, very, very low death rates from this disease, because they have taken the steps early, and when they have taken those steps, they've been quite definite in what they mean. I think there does seem to be a little bit of a kind of, oh, it's fine, it won't happen to us attitude in many communities in the UK, and also the expectation that people have an automatic right to do what they want, regardless of the impacts and consequences on others. And I think that speaks to a much broader political point. Our society has lost its ability to think collectively, to think in a cooperative manner. We've become atomized and individualized to the extent that when a crisis like this hits, actually individual actions aren't seen as having social and public health consequences. And I think there's a huge job of work for us to do as people interested in politics, as people interested in building a better and different kind of society, that collective understanding and collective action is really understood. Health is not an individual issue. Health is very, very clearly a public, collective, social issue. Yes, it has very, very clearly individual consequences and individual impacts, but there are also much wider social and economic impacts more broadly, and we need to understand those connections much better. I think if we get to a position where we do have that understanding, then the proper international cooperation that we've seen elsewhere, and we've seen actually ourselves be part of. I mean, the response. The response to the crisis in the 1930s was dealt with eventually by an international approach. It's understanding that we don't have to think that as an island state, we either have all the answers, or we should have all the answers, or we don't need anybody else to work with, because that's not how we function as humans. It's not how our societies and our communities, which transcend international boundaries all over the world, we need to recognize that. So we need to actually stop the prevarication that we've seen from the UK government, actively engage in a meaningful way in the schemes that are being developed in Europe and elsewhere to ensure that we do have the right systems and processes in place to prevent the spread of this disease, which we know kills people.
Yeah. As you say, it is a public health issue. And last night we saw an announcement kind of sneaked out quite late in the evening that Public Health England is to be shut down and replaced by a new agency, which will have the responsibility of protecting England against another pandemic. Alan, do you think this announcement, do you think it says more that Public Health England just wasn't up to the job and needed to be kind of revamped or replaced? Or is this just a distraction, a kind of look at the big special world-beating thing we're building, rather than focusing on what Public Health England is actually doing right now?
Yes, well, again, I think I should be on triple time for this, because the rabbit I have to pull out of the hat in my expertise here is I am married to a very wonderful Scottish-trained retired midwife and nurse, who thus consequently has been watching and interpreting for me with a fine-tooth comb what's been going on here in London. But we've also been regular viewers of the Scottish announcements because with interest, I have interest in the northwest of Scotland and a very fine holiday place. So I'm regularly and also in Edinburgh. So I've been following the distinctions and the differences. And simply, the conclusion is not fit for purpose. And also grave concern about the quality of the administrative and managerial quality of the persons, the individuals that from the start have been running this. I remember a health committee being broadcast in about the second week of March, and people were wheeled out from the NHS and Public Health England to comment on the supply of PPE. And we were promised by these senior bureaucrats that were representing that the problem would be solved at least within 1 week. It's hardly barely been solved now. Track and test, certainly in England, is a catastrophe. And by the way, I would add, the reason people are being forced into this blanket 14-day lockdown is because we don't have in place, and I fully agree with my colleague here, that we just don't have in place quite the same type of effective systems that can fine tune and identify issues, because there's a multitude of ways in which you can prevent the spread, but the sledgehammer approach is just to tell people isolate for 14 days. I was investigating how to go to Ukraine when Britain was listed as what was described as a red country. That was a country that, unless you took steps of testing when you arrived in Ukraine, you would have to go into a similar 14-day lockdown. But there were options available, and also they had an application that you could load up before you arrived in Ukraine that enabled you to be tracked using your mobile phone. You could log into this, and you could then engage with the Ukrainian COVID-19 testing system on the time of your arrival or pre-arrival, and then with the follow-up of the 3-5-day tests, and come off the quarantine process much earlier. Think of the economic saving for that. So yes, no real surprise that we need a shake-up with the way public health is organised in England. I should emphasise we are talking about the English aspect here. We are very aware, sitting in London, people like me, a Scot sitting in London, that matters have been managed very, very differently in Scotland, and I very much have respected the way in which I would consider the Scottish people have been very carefully protected, and we've been very aware how regulations, the regulatory and guideline environment has been different in Scotland. So I'm in a position to very much compare the two. And always I have found the concern that's come through from Scotland was clearly erring on the side of what was best for the Scottish people and for the health of the Scottish people. In England, we've always been concerned that there's been corners cut and economic considerations. And I think Public Health England may have lent a little bit too far in that direction. Certainly serious questions, and no surprise about its abolition.
Yeah. Well, we will obviously see how that replacement does operate once it comes into force. But we move on now, and the other big story of the last couple of weeks has been, well, not even exam results, just academic results published first in Scotland last week and then in England this week. Over the initial decision overturned in Scotland this week. There is still a lot of anger and protest in England. So Maggie, I think I'll come to you first on this. Are we just going to have to accept that everybody's results this year are probably always going to be seen as kind of almost having a wee asterisk next to them.
Well, I mean, Ken, you're right to say that it's been a real fiasco across the whole of the UK, really, and I think what's happened in both the Scottish and the English systems is really quite interesting, because for me it speaks to a much broader point about what education is for and what exams are for. We've known for some considerable time that A-level performance or higher performance is actually not that good an indicator on how people will do in degree level education at university. You know, the people who get into university, maybe by the skin of their teeth or through clearing or with poorer grades than might be expected, and actually thrive and fly through a university degree, and the reverse is also true. So actually, yes, this year's results, I think, well, 20, so much about 2020 will have a little asterisk next to it, won't
Yeah.
it? Or 2020, that year. But I think it gives us a real opportunity to completely rethink what we mean by education and what we mean by school level education, because we still have in in pretty much the whole of the UK, although there are very stark differences in different systems in the different nations, we have an education system that was created for an industrial country, and for a country that really no longer exists. We haven't seen the same kinds of transformations in our education system as we have seen in society, in our economy, in the labour market, in all aspects of our lives. And I think this actually gives us a real opportunity to rethink that, to actually trust our teachers as the professionals they are, trust their judgments, trust their understandings of their pupils, and consider what it is that we are trying to instill in our young people as part of their school education. I think, you know, we've seen in the different responses between Holyrood and Westminster. I think we've seen quite a stark different response to democracy, really. In Scotland, the Scottish government made a mistake. They made the wrong decisions. They were called out on it. People protested. There was a democratic movement of protest, and the use of democratic tools and democratic instruments to change those things, to put those mistakes right. An apology from the Scottish government and an admission that, yes, we need to do things differently and we need to do things better. We've seen none of that in Westminster. And I think that speaks to a profound difference in understanding of the role of people in democracy in Scotland, and the ability of the Scottish government to actually adapt to and respond to its people in a way that I don't see happening in Westminster anytime soon. So I think there's actually a lot in this situation. There's a big question around the value of exams. We know that they are poor indicators of ability to interpret results and educational success further down the line. And I think there's also a very, very, very clear democratic argument that in Scotland, because of the ability and the willingness of the Scottish government to listen, and the Scottish Parliament being set up in a way that listening is possible. I think that those for me are the two take-home messages of the last week. Let's rethink what we are trying to assess when we come to assess our 16, 17 and 18-year-olds at a time when they are making decisions that could affect the rest of their lives. Let's reassess what we mean by education, and let's listen to the education professionals in this. We've gone some way in Scotland with the curriculum for excellence and some of the really, really good things that are in that, but we need to make sure that all of our systems take those changes and transformations into account. And the way the SQA was instructed to act the way that it was able to act clearly doesn't give us the kind of system that we need for our future.
Yeah.
So So I think that the stark difference between England and Scotland in the way that the two respective parliaments have handled this gives us, I think, quite a clear example of how much better at just being democratic the Scottish Parliament is, and how much better able to respond to crises like this the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government can be.
So, Alan, just to come to you now. Obviously, you're in the university sector. How has the sector responded to this issue with A levels this week, and obviously the hires last week?
Yes, very much so. Thanks for giving me so far a 4 out of 4 of subjects close to my heart. I spent 35 years dealing with university, polytechnic admissions, Oxford University in the 80s through to the mid-90s, and first of all Kingston Polytechnic, then Kingston University. Although I have to say only until 2017, but I am very familiar with the processes both in Scotland and in the various universities in England. And as you point out, we are talking, of course, and shouldn't consider these results and their impact purely on the move forward into further higher education. Let's remember there's essentially 2 ways forward for young people with these qualifications. They'll seek immediately employment somewhere. They'll be putting in application forms, or maybe have gone to employers already, or it will be a move into education. And if we just take the former, the Scottish decision is just so absolutely obviously the correct one, to err on the side of benefit, and maybe the grade awarded might be a little bit higher than if it had gone through the conventional processes. But I would argue, well, that's a matter for the employer to sort out. The employer at most tends to use grades just as a kind of sifting, separating process. So if we want to avoid any disadvantage, obviously we err on the side of the positive, and then leave the employer to sort it out. Okay, they might have a few more people to interview, but at the end of the day, let's not disadvantage the person going forward into employment. And then if we turn to the move forward into education, many colleges and universities have already been offering places on the predicted grades. This has been going on for, certainly in my university, at least the last 5-6 years. And let's also not get too tied up on the exam-based, the more highly exam-based qualifications, which are the ones in trouble largely. In England, we have a thing called BTEC. I think in Scotland, it's ScotVec or something. There's a whole vocationally oriented set of qualifications that are much less exam-centred, and therefore less of an issue with the results. But there clearly is an issue with the exam-centred ones. We've just heard that the guidance on the appeals process, which was issued yesterday in England, got withdrawn late yesterday evening. So we're in a complete state of flux down here in England, in contrast to bravo Scotland again. A bit of good Scottish common sense seems to have got into this, and I just hope it acts as an exemplar for the English education system we have down here. On balance, as somebody who has dealt with admissions, I actually don't believe the disadvantage. We have to be careful this doesn't become a big political noise. I know my colleagues will be giving very definite consideration and adjustments, and talking directly to all those cases that are borderline. And I know that university admissions tutors, the length and breadth certainly of England and Wales, that have got the difficult issues to deal with, they will be treating very sympathetically the students in these difficult times. But bravo Scotland, and certainly things will be a lot easier at Dundee University after that decision that's been made by the Scottish Government than it is down here at my Kingston University.
Yeah. Well, We do want to look at Scotland just finally before the end of the show because this week we saw a YouGov poll showing support for independence at 53%. This is a record high in a YouGov poll, very close to the 54% that we've seen in a couple of other polls already this year. So Maggie, in your role as convener of the Scottish Independence Convention, is this the product of all your hard work, or is something else going on?
Oh, Kenny, I would love to claim credit for this, but firstly, that's not my style, and also I don't think we can see this kind of shift as down to any one organisation or one individual, with the possible exception of the UK Prime Minister. I think the way in which the British government has handled quite a lot of things over the last few months has contributed to that significantly. But I think it's always been my goal, and the thing with the movement, the independence movement that I'm interested in, is building the social movement so that independence becomes inevitable, building the sort of common understanding that Scotland, as a small country in the north of Europe, can be successful, can be more equal, can be a much fairer place for people from all over the world to live in. And I think part of this is about behaving like a normal democratic country, not the sclerotic mess we see at Westminster. And actually, the school exam results fiasco is a very good example of that. I think we've seen how this week in Scotland how a normal democracy should work. A poor decision is made, and through society engaging with and participating in that democratic process, uses its power to have that decision overturned. Now, 53% being in favour of independence is great, but I want to see that number grow. I want there to be a very, very clear public consensus that independence is the right way forward for Scotland. And the Independence Convention and our campaign organisation, Voices for Scotland, are working on different elements of this. We have work underway to once we get either another referendum or a very clear decision that Scotland will be an independent country. We are working on what are the kinds of institutions, what are the kinds of structures we need in place to run a country. But before we get there, we are seeking to build support with people who maybe voted no in 2014 or are undecided, don't know which way they would vote. We want to have those conversations, be able to have the kinds of open, genuine discussions about what we want for the future
Mm.
for our country. So I think, there are a couple of things. Living in a country where the government can admit it's made a mistake and change a decision is really, really important. That is not a sign of weakness, as U-turns are so often portrayed in the press and in the right-wing political sphere. But that's actually a sign of huge democratic strength and political strength as well. And I think the other aspect of this, for me, very much comes down to Scotland as a country should have the right to determine its own constitutional future. And actually, we saw in the claim of right, I think was it signed in 1989, we had politicians from across the political spectrum, with the exception of the Conservatives, sign up to the claim of right. Those politicians, including people like Gordon Brown, Charlie Kennedy, Min Campbell, Alistair Darling, they all signed that claim of right, saying that Scotland has the right to determine its own future. And I think that's what we need to hold on to. And we need to be developing the political organisation around that, as well as having the kinds of conversations with society more broadly in communities where people are, to make sure that we give people the information they need, and we also listen to the hopes and fears and dreams and aspirations that Scottish people have for their country. I believe independence is inevitable. I would like to see it sooner rather than later, because I think the sooner we get away from Westminster mess, the better for communities in Scotland, and actually I think the better for communities in England and elsewhere in the UK as well, because we can chart the way, show that it is possible to do democracy at this kind of scale, and to do it well and to do it right. And to me, that's what's so important about the social movement for independence.
Yeah. Worth mentioning as well, you mentioned the claim of right there, that it was unanimously endorsed by the House of Commons just a couple of years ago as well. So there is that. But Alan, from London, obviously, this probably looks a little bit different. What's been your perspective on seeing this rise in support, this now apparent majority support for independence?
I don't believe this. You've scored a 5 out of 5. As I'm listening to this, my memory is going back nearly half a century to a young lady called Margot MacDonald and me, a student in Edinburgh, watching that great by-election win in 1973 that really started to waken up thinking. And I remember, I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of the law professor in Edinburgh who basically gave the intellectual argument for Scottish independence. As a scientist, I understand our energy independence. I've just talked earlier about these two great, magnificently run and managed nuclear power stations we have, giving baseload to Scotland. As a young Boy Scout in Edinburgh, I used to go across to Denmark and see this small country of 5 million just get on with it. So the argument's easy one for me. And my perspective is, why don't make life easier for England and those people down here in London or my friends in London? Scotland wants its independence. And by the way, as an academic, I've always been prepared to say at the turnaround, I love this situation we're hearing about in Scotland, that when the facts change, of course it's honourable to rethink and maybe change your mind. And for the Scottish people, it's unarguable. The whole political environment, the facts have changed with Brexit. So I just don't get any argument that the Scottish people don't have the right to come round again and review the political situation they find themselves in. And technical issues like the border, well, that's all going to be solved. Look, we're going to have Northern Ireland sitting on a border with a country that is in the EU. That country is called Ireland. And so what's the problem with Northern England having a border with a country called Scotland that's in the EU, as it's clearly declared it wants to be, as an independent country? So I really am maybe just a pragmatic Scot that I don't see the problems here. Just let's get on with it.
Well, that's quite a way to end the show. So thank you very much to Maggie Chapman and Alan Flowers for joining us today. It's been a little bit of a difficult day for us here in the studio. We are once again a person short in the studio, so we've been trying to cope as best we can. I know it hasn't been our greatest effort, but we thank you very much for joining us for it anyway. If you would like to help support Broadcasting Scotland to help us get a wee bit better at this, then do please go to broadcastingscotland.scot/register. Sign up there as a supporter, and your £5 a month helps us pay the bills here at Broadcasting Scotland, and also then to develop our programme making ability. If you're not able to support us financially, we do absolutely understand. The shows will always be free to view online, but you can still make a big difference by following us on Twitter at Broadcast Scot. If you can find us on Facebook as well, just search Broadcasting Scotland. You can find us on YouTube as well. Find our channel there and subscribe. Also like the videos there, share them around, let people know where we are and what we do. Let people know why you support Broadcasting Scotland, and you can help grow our audience that way. And finally, if you want to get involved here at Broadcasting Scotland, there are lots of opportunities. As I say, with one person missing, it makes a lot of difference to what we're able to do here, or at least do very well. So we are always looking for people to help out behind the scenes and in front of the camera as well. So do please get in touch if you've got any interest in getting involved that way. But that is absolutely all we have time for. So Gordon will be back tomorrow at 7 with another with another Scotland at 7, excuse me. I'll be back at my normal slot on Tuesday evening. But until then, have a great Sunday. Goodbye.